All right, we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Tim Profeta. I'm the director of the Nicholas Institute at Duke University. I think it's over my left shoulder who we are. I'm very excited to be joined by two friends and colleagues here to talk about I think the title was Rising from the Ashes, the Clean Power Plan, or the Aftermath of the Clean Power Plan. And I think that's actually, I think this conference should be more about where we go now that the Clean Power Plan is being sort of reversed in some manner by the Trump administration. I'd like to say that I can't think of two colleagues I'd like to explore this with more than Megan and Craig. To my right, I have Megan Saransky, who's now the executive director for the Center for Applied Environmental Law and Policy out of Boulder. But I don't know that there are many people who shed more blood, sweat, and tears on the Clean Power Plan process than Megan, first working with Environmental Defense Fund and then the White House. And then to her right is Craig Siegel, who's the Assistant Chief Counsel at the ARB, who oversees the legal issues and the Clean Power Plan processes for the state of California. So between them, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears on this effort. 2 years ago in this event, I think we were talking about the Clean Power Plan. We were arguing about whether one should have a rate-based trading system or a mass-based trading system.
At this point, either would be fine.
It's become a little bit like, arguing whether, what Betamax to buy. But as most people know very well, the elections have consequences, and the election of President Trump has indicated that the Trump administration is not going to go forward with the rule finalized by the Obama administration. The rule was stayed by the Supreme Court, and now they have gotten permission from the circuit courts to produce a new rule. But there's a question of what they will produce. I think it was last week, a bunch of the former attorney generals and good friends of our current EPA administrator asked him not to replace the rule, but actually to just repeal it and have a different interpretation of the authorities such that they do not have to replace it. But what I'd like to focus us on, and I've asked my two colleagues to focus on, is really, where we evolved from the Clean Power Plan process. As the federal government does look to reverse it, there has been a lot of activity in other levels of government in the states that both of my colleagues work with on climate leadership. Some of what happened in the Clean Power Plan process actually initiated processes and activities that I think have had legs, even though the rule no longer will stand at the EPA level. I'd like to sort of explore that a little bit. What also has come from the states in terms of the classic vacuum that's been created in leadership from the federal government, and who's filling it and what are they doing. And then I would like to not completely forget about the Clean Air Act and the Clean Power Plan. There was a lot of effort put into that document. There was a lot of process, and as far as I can tell, there still is a Clean Air Act requirement to act on the climate change pollution. So what happens on the longer term horizon, and is this really a dead document, or is it actually a document that just has to be reharvested from in some future year? So what I asked both Megan and Craig to do is to think about 5 to 10 minutes of comments on those sort of themes, and then we'll have some conversation. And I do then want to turn to the audience, even those in the back row. I'll be calling on you, and see if we can get some engagement in the room as well. So Megan, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Tim, and thank you for having me. This is good to have a microphone on. Thank you, Craig. Yep. This is a very helpful set of panelists to be here. They turn on your microphone for you. So it might help to start with exactly where we are on the Clean Power Plan, because technically it's still an enacted regulation, which is hard to remember sometimes because there are so many different ways in which it has been attacked, and the process to try to start to repeal it and revoke it has started in a number of different ways. But we had an argument before the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals in September of 2016, and that argument went, I would say, quite well before the entire D.C. Circuit en banc court. And then we were waiting for a decision, and then the election happened, and then Trump was elected, and that group of judges in the en banc court clearly cannot figure out what they want to do with this case. So you have the group of states supporting the Clean Power Plan, the environmental NGOs telling this court, you have to make this decision, and the federal government saying, please do not make this decision. Now we're rethinking this whole regulatory framework. And the court, in all of the other situations where they've been asked not to decide a case, have just put the case on ice indefinitely. They've just put it into abeyance. And with this one, the DC Circuit keeps saying, okay, we'll give you 60 days. Come back and tell us what's happening in 60 days. And then we come back and tell them what's been happening in 60 days, and then we get another, we'll give you another 60 days. And so there's clearly this like massive divide within that group of judges about how to handle this very strange situation where you have a case that was fully briefed and argued, and now an election and a new EPA administrator who is claiming that he needs to pull back the Clean Power Plan because he does not believe that he has the legal authority to go forward with it, which, by the way, is exactly the question that is before the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, while asking the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, please do not tell me if I have the legal authority to go forward with the Clean Power Plan while I'm busy telling you that I do not have the legal authority to go forward with the Clean Power Plan. For someone who's been working on this framework for a while, this is infuriating, does not begin to describe the emotional experience of what's happening right now. So we have that in the court. At the same time, we have EPA proposing both a repeal of the Clean Power Plan on that legal argument, saying that they don't think that it's the best interpretation of the statute to say that the best system of emission reduction for power plants and greenhouse gas emissions allows you to look at the potential to shift generation from higher emitting plants to lower emitting plants. That's one standalone process. We're actually still in an open public comment period on that process. And then there was a separate announcement of proposed rulemaking where EPA said, well, we're thinking about whether or not we should replace the Clean Power Plan. Never mind the statute that says thou shall address dangerous air pollutants from existing sources. And we obviously still have the endangerment finding that greenhouse gas emissions do endanger public health and welfare. So they're in this early comment period about whether or not they should replace it, and if so, how. In that comment period, they have looked only at heat rate improvements as like what would be the best system of emission reduction. That comment period has closed, and then the word on the street is that the plan is to propose a replacement and finalize a replacement to the Clean Power Plan in this calendar year, which would be a regulatory miracle if it happens. Generally speaking, agencies that are trying to do the right thing are not able to appropriately look at the technical merits of these questions, respond to public comments, and finalize a rule in that period of time. We'll see. Maybe they've got superpowers at this point. Couple of interesting things to note about this whole process is we're now seeing hints of what they would like to do over the longer term in these documents. The legal arguments that were made in the repeal to the Clean Power Plan were nothing new. They were the same legal arguments that had been made by the challengers to the Clean Power Plan. So that's not particularly interesting. What is interesting is that in the regulatory analysis of cost and benefits that accompany the Clean Power Plan, they've done some really interesting things. One, there's an abandonment of the social cost of carbon, looking at the total impacts of greenhouse gases that are emitted in terms of a cost-benefit analysis in favor of what they're calling a domestic cost of carbon, where they're trying to only look at impacts to the United States. Two, there is an effort to take, and I'm not going to get into this because it's only relevant as an exercise of like bizarre politics, but they've taken all of the savings that you saw under the Clean Power Plan from the electricity that was not generated because people invested in energy efficiency to reduce emissions, and they've added up all of those savings, and that's billions of dollars of this electricity that was not actually generated. And they've put that amount onto the benefits column of the Clean Power Plan and also onto the costs column of the Clean Power Plan, which obviously doesn't change the net cost benefit analysis at all, because it's the same number that you've added to both columns, but it does give you a really big cost number to talk about if you, for example, wanted that as a talking point. So that was an interesting exercise in mathematics, going back to second grade. And then the third thing, which is not really very funny, is they have done what they're calling sensitivity analyses of the impacts of particulate matter 2.5, PM 2.5, the really tiny particulate matter emissions, where they're not looking at the health impacts of reducing PM 2.5, either below the level of the ambient air quality standards for PM 2.5 or below the level of two studies that looked at geographic areas that had specific PM levels and the health harms that you saw in those geographic areas. And that is an effort to really go to the heart of clean air protections more broadly, because particulate matter, the tiny particulate matter kills people. It means people die sooner than they would otherwise die. And that is obviously a very large impact when you're looking at the benefits of a clean air rule. And if you can cut out a bunch of those benefits, your rule suddenly doesn't look as beneficial as it would if you actually looked at those PM 2.5 benefits. So that is it's been a sort of cause of certain elements of the anti-regulatory movement for a long time, and this is an effort that is not supported by science, is not supported by anything in what you're supposed to do under a normal regulatory impact analysis, but is definitely an effort to try to change the way that these clean air protections look going forward as a foundation for trying to roll them back. So that's just all sort of context worth noting. But to get back to Tim's question about what happens going forward, all of these processes that have been set in motion by the EPA now are going to end up back in court. And so we are going to probably get some answers to some of the questions that we've been working on in the context of the Clean Power Plan for a long time. So the agency is going, before the world and saying, we do not have the statutory authority to look at generation shifting, and so we are going to put in place a different statutory authority. That will be challenged in court, because if the agency says, we don't have the authority to do this Clean Power Plan thing, and all we have the authority to do is this heat rate improvement thing, which, by the way, gets us very, very small emission reductions, or actually increases emissions if you actually get a rebound effect and those more efficient coal plants dispatch more frequently. We're then going to be going back before the DC Circuit to say, is that okay, DC Circuit, to look at this statute that is all about protecting human health and the environment, say that you prefer a different statutory interpretation because that's your legal reading, and not think at all about the consequences for human health and the environment of that exercise, and constrain yourself to a totally ineffective environmental standard as a result. So the court battles that are now being triggered by the administrative processes on the Clean Power Plan are going to get us into some really interesting litigation around some of the questions that we've been wrestling with for a long time around sort of what can you do under Section 111. It's possible that those can work out in a way that won't give us a lot of clarity going forward, but they actually might give us some more clarity going forward, which I think will play into the question of, assuming there's a reversal and who's in the White House, what are we doing next in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in the power sector in this country? The happy part about all of this, of course, is that greenhouse gas emissions for the power sector are going down dramatically without the Clean Power Plan, which does mean that I did not do my job effectively, and the Clean Power Plan was not strong enough to begin with. I apologize for that, sincerely. But it kind of helps me sleep better at night as we work through all of these legal battles to know that emissions are coming down in the power sector. And I think there have been some really interesting changes in the way that individual power companies and states think about what is possible and what they should do going forward. Because what the Clean Power Plan created was a many-year-long discussion with state regulators, with power companies, with other stakeholders about how you would reduce emissions in your state going forward under this construct. which means you now have a whole bunch of state regulators across the country who are much more familiar and comfortable with the idea of what a carbon reduction framework could look like for their state. They've been talking to their stakeholders about it for years. They now understand how it works in a way that, like, if this isn't your line of business, you might not be in the weeds of a cap and trade program if you didn't have to be. But they're now sort of more comfortable with that. And so you do have states like Virginia moving forward with a cap and trade program. You have New Jersey ready to rejoin RGGI. You have Oregon looking at new legislation in terms of cap and trade authority, and I don't think that that has to be the end. I think that it is possible, particularly in the context of declining emission trajectories in other states, to keep building climate policies on top of what's the change that's happening in the power sector and get more and more stakeholders engaged and comfortable with these types of programs, which really helps lay the foundation for where we can go at the federal level going forward. And that's just on the state policy side. On the power sector side, you had power companies looking at how they were going to reduce their emissions over time. And lo and behold, a lot of them are going to make a lot of money by reducing emissions because a lot of them get paid for building new infrastructure. And if you're going to transition your infrastructure, you're building new infrastructure, you're getting rate recovery, et cetera. They've figured out business models that work in decarbonization. And so now you have companies like DTE saying, we're going to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050. Where did that come from? It came from the fact that they were thinking about how you would reduce emissions of their portfolio under this federal framework. And now they know how to do it and know that it would actually totally make sense for their company and make economic sense. You have Berkshire Hathaway announcing massive plans to go 100% renewable over time. Xcel Energy has a very, very strong carbon dioxide reduction goal and currently a package before the PUC in Colorado to do another major infrastructure transition. So you're seeing these examples not in California, not in New England, but in the middle of the country where there is movement because it's become clear that that's actually feasible. Now we can get into all of the market forces that make that possible, the cheap natural gas, the dropping renewable costs, all of which is fundamentally important to this all being feasible. But I think the legacy of the Clean Power Plan is potentially somewhat underestimated. I am perhaps a bit of a suspect source of having this opinion, given how much I've worked on it. But I will nonetheless assert that I think it has actually created change at the state level in terms of what is possible for state regulators because of the discussions they've had, and has certainly moved companies to think about decarbonization and how that can work for their business models in a way that is exciting and powerful at this moment.
Great, Megan. That's a great tour de force. Now, Craig, I'm going to pass it to you. I particularly would invite you to look at the sort of state leadership that California is giving, but also your peers around the state are giving, given the circumstances with the federal government. So
I will do that thing. So I want to talk about three things. One, building a little bit on Megan's discussion of the law, why any smart state or smart utility or smart power plant owner should really not be viewing this as a dead document in the long term, and why it doesn't make sense in terms of basic administrative law principles and Clean Air Act principles to think this is going away. And in fact, they'd better hope it is not going away because their alternatives are way worse from the perspective of sort of short-term fossil. Two, thinking more about the state discussion that Megan and Tim have teed up, how do states interact within this federal frame now and later to help drive this transition, and how is what's happening in the states well beyond federal control is moving this forward? And finally, some reflections on how this winds up tying into other sectors and other sort of justice claims, because, quite frankly, this is not a set of legal games. This is the future of civilization and the fate of billions of people. And it is, profoundly morally offensive to see this shirking of our necessary work at the federal level right now, in addition to being illegal and unwise. And so I think a lot of the work of good government, state government, federal government, is caring for your people. And the incredible narrow capture, the sort of the poverty of the thinking we're seeing in these proposed repeal and replacement documents speaks to that. And it speaks to that not just in moral terms, but in legal terms, which is to say, much of the repeal proposals are based on this premise that the Clean Air Act is designed to be ineffective. You have this broad remedial statute that for more than 40 years, in addition to producing literally trillions of dollars in net benefits, has been used to find and address problems as they come. And that this particular framework, among the most flexible in the Act, looking to federal goal setting and a wide array of state responses, made particularly wide in the Clean Power Plan's design to accommodate systems like California's that were already well developed, in addition to states that were just beginning to develop their systems, somehow cannot grapple in the most effective available way with the power sector's emissions by looking at how the power sector actually works, by looking seriously at generation shifting and the fact that this is one machine that EPA has been asked to regulate. So the legal premise that EPA is now asking for now stakeholders, but ultimately courts perhaps to accept, is that the Act requires a narrowness of vision wholly inconsistent with the administrative law precepts that, under which Congress designed it. And you'll see this verbiage about, well, Congress didn't hide elephants in mouse holes, and therefore this sweeping plan can't possibly be supported by the statute. But the statute is sweeping. It has cut national air pollution on average about 70% from pre-statute levels. It saved thousands of lives. It was designed to do this sort of thing and to give room for smart, passionate people working with the evidence to come to reasonable conclusions. And more than that, even if EPA's proposal, somehow has legal legs, the statute has broad authority to consider things like the remaining useful life of plants and whether looking at plants even isolated, because the off switch, after all, is inside the facility boundary, to borrow, Scott Pruitt's sort of defined sense that we're just thinking about what an owner can do, to chart courses for retirement or curtailment over time, consistent with where the market's already going, the bottom line of which is that you're nuts if you're running an aging coal plant years into the future that's killing its neighbors and running off an increasingly non-economic fuel and market. And you see this, as Kentucky regulators are denying, retrofit permits and cost recovery to coal-fired power plants. It's not. There's no reason to think, despite the sorts of cost-benefit games that Megan has described, that there's any rational argument for maintaining or trying to fight against the natural market trends in this sector rather than accelerate them consistent with what the statute's asking the agency to do, and I would think courts would read the statute consistent with its purposes. But suppose they don't. Well, in that case, the Supreme Court has told us that if there's no federal displacing law, federal and state common law and doctrines of nuisance can come increasingly into play. So even if you didn't care about the economics of your facilities or the extreme likelihood of federal action, whether under this program or under a later legislative settlement, one would think you would care about the massive tort liability that's now beginning to wind its way through the courts. So for all sorts of reasons, devising programs, initially for the moment largely state, but ultimately federal, that can appropriately spread this risk, create trajectories to manage it appropriately and help get to a transition, is devoutly what everyone should be asking for, whether it's the utilities or the states. And I think you see that in the conversations the Clean Power Plan nucleated among the states. And I think to anyone looking to a few years down the line as this litigation settles out and begin to see what the federal shape is about, well, how do we move the power sector forward? And as state regulators, there's plenty of room to do so legally and as a matter of policy. I mean, initially, the Clean Air Act is very explicitly save state authority to go beyond whatever it requires. That's bedrock black letter law. So there's nothing stopping states from addressing this sort of onrushing threat to power sector economics and their citizens, and most aren't. You both see, even in very red states, deep reluctance to continue doubling down on these investments and increasing interest in energy efficiency. I mean, watching TVA, for instance, radically embrace energy efficiency, bring in experts from all over the world to help really step up there, begin to say, well, we don't actually need to upgrade our old fossil fleet because we have better options. Watching Southern Company, start thinking seriously about this. This isn't the political divide that characterizes that ideological debate is largely absent, I think, from the reality-based discussions that most companies and states are having, looking seriously at their fleets and their possibilities as the existing plants come to the end of their lives, and you have to start engaging tough questions about how does one maintain tax base? How do we think about jobs? How do we think about shared risk? You look at Montana, thinking about the future of Colstrip. I mean, Utah, thinking about the future of its plants. These conversations are vital and continuing, both nucleated by and encouraged by the Clean Power Plan, but continuing. And that means state regulators actually have quite a lot of authority, both to encourage ongoing procurement and careful investments via their utility commissions and similar institutions, authority to think seriously about carbon pricing and tools like those that California uses, authority to think about RPSs and similar systems like the one that Illinois is pioneering around rewarding zero-emission electricity of whatever sort, all of which are efforts to appropriately steer their state portfolios forward, and notably, efforts that Justice Gorsuch upheld when he was a 10th Circuit judge with regard to Colorado's RPS. So these are well-grounded principles in federalism, both from the state's obligations to protect their people and their longstanding authority over retail power and generation siting. But there's even more than that, and you see this in California, where there's also aggressive efforts to figure out how to think about a power grid that is increasingly renewable, increasingly based around intermittent power, increasingly linked to the mobile source sector. So you see experiments like our PUC and Energy Commission are running, where there's increasing procurement of storage, to the point now where it was actively uneconomic to move forward with gas power plants proposed, and several are retiring in favor of battery storage, a trend that I think we can only expect to continue, as on the mobile source side, it becomes an equally obvious business proposition that the one way to grow utility load is to sell to electric vehicles. So you see enormous interest among many utilities in supporting electrification, especially here in California where we're decoupled and it's just good policies, so we can have the conversation, I think, with cleaner incentives, which will in turn commercialize further the battery technology one needs to skip over any sort of remaining natural gas-based bridge and instead move directly toward a grid that is far more based in renewables and storage, linked profoundly to a move on the mobile source side that recognizes that one of the greatest threats to communities from a criteria pollutant and toxic side is ongoing mobile source pollution. As you know, we've done a lot in this state to cut diesel pollution, for instance, but there's vastly more to do. And you're beginning to see a real move both in heavy duty and light duty toward electrification that's necessary, not just sort of from a good company economic side. If we can buy a car that has 20 moving parts and lasts twice as long as an internal combustion car, sort of why wouldn't you? But also from a deeply felt environmental justice side. And I think that point is also worth making. One of the other conversations the Clean Power Plan helped drive was a serious thought about the deep justice claims for many communities. It's no secret that a long embedded history of racist siting has put many, many poor communities near power plants and near highways. And here in California, in the last session, we passed a state law, AB 617, that focuses our attention directly on communities that may have been left behind and begin looking at cumulative risk and ways to reduce it. That's something any other state could do, and many other states are looking at in a serious way. I think will further drive this trend towards zero emissions technologies that cross the vehicle and stationary source sectors. So, and also engages those communities directly in the conversation we have to be having, because those folks are often the most vulnerable, whether it's through increased smog days or through increased exposure to toxics, or just living in sites that are vulnerable to fire and flood and smoke, to climate change. So I think for the governments that engage this issue, whether it's for economic reasons or political reasons or moral or legal reasons, all these trends and authorities point toward a revitalization of these issues and continued work on them. I also think it's incredibly likely that regardless of what this administration tries to do, this debate will be available to be joined with all the authorities the Clean Air Act continues to have when the next administration takes office. And so, for all that it has been a wildly depressing year for those of us who worked on the Clean Power Plan, I don't think, in the end, that the facts support sort of the notion that we're walking away. Instead, I think that what we're seeing here is a partial retreat, but ultimately one that can't reverse the trends toward a more just and reasonable future in this area.
Thanks, Craig. So many different veins I could follow in terms of your comments. I want to sort of think of one thing with in thinking about this conference and a lot of attendees of this conference. One of the things the Clean Power Plan definitely gave a little bit of a significant push towards was the usage of market-based instruments to try and make efficient sense of the generation shifting and those sorts of choices that the regulated entities are going to have. How much, here we have a characterization of, a correct characterization, in my personal opinion, that utilities and states, and not just the typical actors, have been moving in this direction, probably even before the Clean Power Plan, but the Clean Power Plan helped focus them on. But how much is there a risk that we'll lose the ability to use the efficiency of a market device, and or how much can that also remain as a legacy of the Clean Power Plan? And again, of course, thinking about the attendees of this conference, many who operate in those ecosystem service markets and the like that sort of grease the usage of those devices.
Well, one thing the Clean Power Plan did really well was include what was called a state measures approach that recognized that more complete markets and programs of the sort that California and others have were appropriate for compliance with appropriate cross-modeling and appropriate controls. EPA's current proposals are legally and factually incoherent, but express real skepticism as to the utility of trading programs. They leave a lot of that uncertain. On the one hand, for years now, within the general, not the Clean Power Plan regulations, but within the general federal 111D regulations, there's been explicit, permission for emissions trading when appropriate. And that's makes perfect sense because EPA for years has used appropriate market designs when that's made sense. And it's completely unclear to me why that would not be permissible here as a matter of law, given the long history of the use of these tools in many different contexts with appropriate enforcement and design. That said, many of the proposals in the thin replacement document are designed to impede the efficiency of market functioning, either intentionally or sort of as an accidental matter. There's a strong focus on plant-by-plant standards and state-by-state standards, many of which might not be federally determined without a clear federal structure to establish trading baselines or core market certainty. So I think if this is pursued, the likely possibility based on what has sort of been partially outlined is an extremely inefficient system that largely encourages the continued running of really inefficient individual plants, each with their own standard. If you do get that sort of snowflake gossamer approach, where each plant gets a standard that it can meet, which is sort of like the everyone gets a prize, theory of second grade relay races, there's very little incentive for a sensible market program to find an economically efficient outcome, because essentially everyone's already gotten their medal for polluting just as much as they can. And so I think that should be both offensive to folks in this room, because it makes zero sense in terms of how one would efficiently design a program. And it also raises really troubling questions about other functioning markets under the Clean Air Act and other contexts, where EPA has long said that, one, this is fine, and two, this is useful. So I think the question is, why not here where it actually makes more sense? And why would you create a system that sets up utilities and ratepayers to reward continued non-economic operation of a power grid, which functionally setting up everyone for bill and rate increases that will then be insisted upon. So it's essentially an enormous potential subsidy to some of the worst planners in the sector, with very little support for sensible planning that would actually protect the majority of the public's economic interests.
And then I would just add to that if you look at the legal argument that EPA is making now, they're trying to hinge this. You can't possibly look at generation shifting on a couple of words in the statute, including the phrase, the application of the best system of emission reduction to the existing sources. So there's this two-part process under Section 111 where EPA identifies the best system of emission reduction for that sector and the pollutant, and then figures out what you can get in terms of emission reductions through the application of that best system of emission reduction to the existing sources, and then states set standards of performance to make sure that you actually get to the emission reductions at the end of the day. And they have all of this flexibility that EPA bent over backwards to maximize in the context of the Clean Power Plan. The same words that EPA wants to hinge their new narrow interpretation of what is the best system of emission reduction and what can that entail apply both to the best system of emission reduction exercise and to the standards of performance exercise at the state level, which means if EPA is correct that you cannot do generation shifting and effectively market-based averaging programs in the context of identifying the best system of emission reduction for this source and this pollutant, you also cannot do it on the implementation side. Dominion actually filed an amicus brief in the Clean Power Plan litigation, making this point to the court, like, please, court, do not listen to the folks who are challenging the Clean Power Plan, because we really like compliance flexibilities and market-based flexibilities and averaging, and that's what makes sense in the context of our sector and this pollutant. So please, please do not hamstring this program by taking this very narrow view. So one potential consequence, if EPA's view were to be upheld by courts as the only way that you can interpret Section 111, you actually do have a risk that then on the compliance side, those flexibilities are gone.
Oh, and to add one other thing, and for those of you who are interested in power markets, think about what this does to environmental dispatch or dispatch planning generally, where it becomes impossible to, since you have, each plant has its own particular limit, largely non-economic, factored into the dispatch design, that you cannot sort of manage a reasonable universal price within the market. So what you're doing is creating seams not just between balancing authority areas, you're creating seams between plants, between utilities that, and at each seam, there's the risk of arbitrage or inefficiency. So query, if you take EPA at its word, why they be designing a system that seems in fairly strong tension with the Federal Power Act and state utility planning, which is an area in theory, if you also take them at their word, they're very worried about, because there's a lot of discussion about the importance of not picking winners and of honoring the state's power sectors and of grid operations. But the functional effect of not thinking seriously about compliance prices and how they work across plants in a system that by its nature is dispatched as a group is to create major inefficiencies, not just in the environmental sector, but in other relevant markets that interact with it.
So I want to get out of the Clean Air Act for a second, although I do want to say one thing. We did try and have somebody from the plaintiffs group who challenged the Clean Power Plan join us on this panel as well. They were not able to make it, so yeah. I know you both are depressed by that, but it wasn't. We'll go offline. Yeah. But I do want to. But I want to get out of the Clean Air Act on this market question and into the sort of the legacy question. You have a couple examples there. Virginia now linking into RGGI, whatever they ended up defining that relationship to be. New Jersey rejoining RGGI. Oregon starting to look at this. So how much in terms of that legacy of the action will market-based approaches? Would you forecast market-based approaches to come in, even if it doesn't come under 111 EPA authority? So, because let's just say we don't have a revisitation of this for a good little time. It does seem that another message is that there's action coming at the sub-federal level that is also, but is it going to be balkanized? Is it going to be patchwork quilts? Or are we going to find some efficiencies across that as well? Would you forecast?
So I would say that's actually a challenge to this entire room, because there's no definitive answer to this question. I think the potential for actually moving forward at the state level with sensible market-based policies right now is enormous, because of the legacy of the Clean Power Plan, because of all of those conversations, and because of the political reality that if you move forward as a state with your own framework to address a pollution problem, EPA is going to work really hard to accommodate your framework when they go forward. Sometimes there are some little hiccups. Yeah. But generally speaking, they are going to try really hard to build from what you have created. So there is the potential for states to shape their own destiny here, for companies to shape their own destiny, and to do that through efficient market-based policies. That, however, requires very effective work at the state level with state regulators, with power companies, with other stakeholders, including environmental stakeholders, environmental justice stakeholders, and others, to make this happen. Policy work is hard. It's hard at the federal level, it's hard at the state level. People have to actually get in, get their hands dirty, and get to work. And I'm not trying to tell everybody what to do. All I am saying is that I think this is a moment in this country where you have states feeling like they have retaken the mantle of leadership from the federal government. You had President Obama in charge for 8 years, either talking a lot about climate or not, but then acting a lot on climate towards the end, certainly acting a lot on air pollution throughout the 8 years, and that allows governors and state policymakers to say, okay, someone else has got it right now. We are no longer in that moment, and you see things like the Climate Alliance, where you have mayors and governors across the country saying, we're still in Paris, we're gonna meet our emission reductions, all of which is wonderful and great, but until you take that commitment and actually turn it into policies, we have not captured the potential that there is in this moment, but that potential is real, and if everyone actually gets involved and tries to make things happen, from the business perspective and from the environmental advocates' perspective, it won't happen, but we can make it happen. And if we do make it happen, then I think you see the discussion at the federal level under a new president going in that direction. If we do not seize this moment, then there's a lot more flex in the joints in terms of the direction that you could take at the federal level. I would argue. I don't know. What do you think?
I'm for the audience, I am going to, for the last 10 minutes, ask for questions from the audience. So probably about 5 minutes. I'm going to throw a little bit of a softball to the two of you, but I can't resist, and maybe there was something we could forecast in this. I think, Megan, when you were describing the argument, the D.C. Circuit argument that I think maybe all three of us attended, the issues that were identified by this current EPA as rationale for not acting or for changing direction on a Clean Power Plan were almost precisely the issues that were briefed before that court. I think actually I invited several times somebody to do actually a Microsoft Word compare between the two documents, between the Federal Register notice and the plaintiff's briefs in that case. The argument of judicial economy has been made that, well, don't decide this issue because EPA is revisiting it, but it's revisiting on exactly the issue that is briefed before the court. Is there any way you could think that we could actually get a decision out of the D.C. Circuit on just the, as Megan, as you said, they keep kicking the can down the road 2 months, how would that change the dynamic about the Clean Power Plan? If the D.C. Circuit came back with a decision on this, how would that change what this administration would be obligated to do under the Clean Air Act?
Well, presumably there'd be a challenge to the Supreme Court. So we would not be done with our process at that point. I mean, we are in this weird position where you have a Supreme Court stay of the Clean Power Plan, which is supposed to be pending the resolution of litigation, but now the litigation has moved onto a very, very slow snail's pace. Only these sort of 60-day abeyances, that's the only actual forward momentum in the case. So I think you would probably see a Supreme Court challenge, and then we'd have to see where that goes. But the legal question, if it is, the way the law works when you have broad statutory language like best system of emission reduction, right? That's not a particularly narrow phrase, which means there may well be multiple plausible interpretations of what that means in a given instance. If a court were to say EPA's original Clean Power Plan interpretation of the best system of emission reduction is legal, then we are very clear that what the current administration is doing is voluntarily going for a different reading of the statute, even though the other one was perfectly legal, which puts them in a bit of an awkward position. I'm not sure with this crew that would stop them. I think they would probably still go forward and say, okay, that one is legal, but we would like to do a different one that we're also going to assert is legal, and then we'd be back into court on all of these things. But it would fundamentally change the world for when this particular group of individuals leaves Washington, D.C., and then we go back in and we know that the Clean Power Plan is on solid legal footing, which for all of the thought that went into its legal foundation, litigation is an uncertain business. You never know for sure what you're going to get at the end of the day, and having that certainty means we can build a framework knowing the answer to that question, which would be really, really exciting, and I really wish the court would issue their decision.
And if there is still authority to look beyond the fence line, to look at managing the entire electric system as one machine, like Craig you said, and you were going to apply the inquiry of the best system emissions reductions right now, would you come up with the same level of reductions that was required in the 2016 Clean Power Plan? Or where would you think the technology
No.
would put that
Definitely
standard?
not.
How much stricter do you think it would be if you did the same analysis right now?
So I was on the team that wrote what is so far the only state compliance plan that's been finalized for the Clean Power Plan so far. But what we learned in doing that extensive modeling is California is more than 10 years ahead of the Clean Power Plan targets. And that was with really conservative assumptions. Since we did that work, California's continued to advance policy, and at this point, I think we're even further ahead of the game. But we aren't unique in that way. I mean, one of the lessons here is we're regulating against Moore's Law curves regarding battery storage and prices. And we're also regulating against accelerating climate damage and accelerating changes in cost. So I think it's highly likely that when this comes back, in whatever form it comes back, it can accelerate. There's going to be this set of arguments that we need to sort of really wait more because we're just putting the whole system in place again, which we'll obviously vigorously oppose. Because the right answer is really obvious here, both in terms of urgency of the crisis, readiness of folks, largely as a result of all the work that's being done right now, and economics. So when this returns, or gets all the way implemented, I think we'll probably accelerate it.
All right, I think it's time to take our last 5 minutes and ask for questions from the audience. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question of our panel? Gentleman over here.
You've spoken a lot about the opportunities for states to take action here in the void left, at least temporarily, by the federal government. What do you see as actions that local governments can take? I mean, I know sometimes there are municipally owned utilities, but even beyond necessarily just power generation options, what can local governments do to really help accelerate progress toward the Paris Climate Agreement?
So I'll give a short answer and then kick it over to Craig. But for me, any leverage that local governments have in terms of being a major purchaser of power within their local utility structure, that can be really useful leverage to push for an accelerated transition away from higher emitting sources. But we have these two massive challenge sectors right now, and transportation has now overtaken the power sector as a leading source of greenhouse gas emissions in this country. And there, the big question is, how do we develop the infrastructure that works for electric vehicles to deploy those vehicles more broadly? And I think cities and municipalities can have a big impact in terms of thinking about what is the sensible infrastructure. The way this country does massive infrastructure transitions is you have it start with the government. They build the trains, they build the federal highway system. We need to build the infrastructure to facilitate that transition in the transportation sector, which will then drive the sort of decarbonization of both sectors at the same time. And that, per Craig's point earlier, is a really exciting moment for the power sector because this is a new source of demand and potentially a new source of energy storage. And figuring out how to make all of that work in a way that makes the owners of these vehicles happy, makes the power sector happy, makes the city happy because you're reducing emissions locally. That is kind of the policymaking challenge that we can all wrestle with right now, and frankly, we would have needed to wrestle with regardless of who had won the federal election.
Just one thing you said, now I know Craig wants to speak, is I always think the point of the local emissions in terms of benefit of electrification is not just the CO2 emissions. I think if you are taking the emissions of the criteria pollutants that are creating air pollution in the city center and you're putting them out wherever your generation or your electricity is, and for anybody who's in California, they know that those mobile source emissions is the biggest challenge in those local air, those ones that your municipal citizens really care about, those air pollution goals. Craig?
Yeah, I guess I'll add is, one of my favorite papers in all this is Elinor Ostrom's work on polycentric problem solving. So Ostrom's a Nobel Prize-winning economist from Indiana and wrote a lot on the ways that these really dense problems are solved at every level at once. They're fractal. And that means local governments are every bit as important, and at the moment, man, I hope more important than DC. And I think that both has implications for decisions like, your muni, or how you think about regional transit, or how you think about, the next expansion of your local area formation committee and your urban growth boundary. I mean, all the bread and butter things. But I also think there's sort of a deeper local government responsibility that's just starting to be joined, which is that, and California has begun to work on this through various state law tools that help planning go up and down the levels, although side to side is probably more accurate, which is thinking about choices in terms of the real future we're looking at, of really serious climate disruption, but also really serious innovation, and being able to mediate those justice claims across the groups in a community. It's very rare to see a really serious discussion about who will suffer most in a community, who will suffer least, how can we get to a just outcome as a group. And this may be a subtler thing, but I think one of the things that worries me most about climate change is threats to civic democracy and conversations that encourages folks to panic or to turtle and to sort of, gated communities, or to sort of avoid this larger thing, because it puts pressure on everything. So I think the local government work of maintaining the basic, decent democratic polity and having this conversation about where we're going in the future is, I'm aware, a little squishy, but I actually think critical, because those voices, about reality and about thinking about that justly are just absolutely important to keep calling us back to these questions.
Another question? I have one more, and I'll take it, which is, and we've all been trying to work on this challenge for a long part of our careers. The most frustrating thing, I think, for most of the stakeholders in this conversation, including just about every regulated entity I ever have tried to work with, is the lack of durability of any policy. And we've characterized, I think we've spent some good time in the Clean Air Act and giving a little bit of Environmental Law 101 to the audience, but the authority may be there in 2021 or 2025 for a president and administration wants to act on this under the Clean Air Act. But the authority was there in 2017, and now it wasn't durable. And now anybody who was trying to plan for the Clean Power Plan has at least been frustrated for 4 years. What is it that could make this a more durable solution? Whatever the eventual outcome is, what is it that we are lacking in our polity right now that we could somehow forecast could be acquired to create a durable policy, public sector approach to climate change, so that we can then plan and move forward as a society rather than this sort of whiplash we've been seeing for the last 2 decades? Kind of the mother of all questions.
That's a really big question, and I think it's a question on a lot of different levels, so I'll give 2 different level answers to it. One, the sort of political cynic level, and the other, a more idealistic view. And I'll maybe start with the idealistic view. I don't think what is happening right now is normal, and I don't think we should expect it to continue going forward in this country. The degree to which there is a knee-jerk effort to reverse anything that the Obama administration put in place is not what usually happens when you have a peaceful transition of power anywhere in the world, and certainly not in this country. So the fact that we do have this moment of lack of durability, I think, is because we had a very strange election situation and broader political dynamics in this country that were borne out in the context of that election. And I don't necessarily expect that going forward, because the reality of the Clean Power Plan was you had more stakeholder engagement in the context of the development of that policy than you had ever had before in the context of any EPA policy. And the buy-in from the power sector was massive. The buy-in from states was very, very broad. So you had politically driven litigation challenges that were very energetic, but in terms of actually grappling with the design of the policy and having your concerns received and responded to, I think EPA did an incredible, incredible job. They might have wanted to start a little bit earlier during the 8-year term. Yeah. That would have helped with durability. So that's my idealistic answer, is I don't think that the fact that we're experiencing this now, I don't think necessarily means we will experience it forever going forward. The more cynical answer, I would say, is the more we develop these markets at the state level, the more power companies realize how workable a lower carbon future is for their business model, the more stakeholders we have who have something to gain in this system, the more politically durable it becomes going forward, which is part of why I think the opportunity to build more markets at the state level, even though I know it works for the general North American carbon world theme, I'm not echoing it for that reason. I have no incentive in that sort of world, but I think the more people get comfortable with this structure and the more renewable energy companies are successful, energy efficiency companies are successful, trading companies are successful, that just changes the politics, which is why we still have the production tax credit for wind and solar, even with this Congress and this president, because you have industry stakeholders that fought for it and fought for it to remain even after the transition.
You've got a red sign, so you got 30 seconds to solve this.
All right, I'll add is that I think durability is actually understated in that these changes are permanent and long-lasting in this market and in our society. And there's retrenchment, sure, but it's not all the way back to ground zero retrenchment. And the overall trend, if you think about it, we've had a theory of climate change since what, our NES, 120 years ago, and well aware of it maybe for 50 to 60 years. That is an exceptionally short time to redo human society and industrial engineering, and there's been enormous progress. I think in the same way there weren't like headlines in England in 1850, industrial revolution underway. The big stories don't get the headlines, but they accrue. In the same way as we sort of redo this and rethink how it's all going to be, there's a bias for the short-term, chaos or frustration headline, but the multi-decadal trend is right, and that is because it's also true.
Great conclusion, Craig, and please join me in thanking our two panelists for